It's the Morning Star Drive 117.8. You soaring up with sky, now's the time, don't delay. I'm sitting in my ride and it's time to fly. So let's realign, just listen and fill your mind.
Hey guys, how is it going? And welcome to the Morning Star Drive on 117.8. It is Wednesday, May 10th, and so happy for you joining us, and we are ready to start the day together with the Lord. So subscribe to us on YouTube, follow us on SoundCloud, and make sure to support us on Patreon. Today, we have an exciting podcast for you. We have Health is Happiness, Bible insights on the life of Luke, and of course, commentaries, updates, and news on what is happening around the world today in this history. All right, everyone, how are you doing? It is Wednesday already, and we have an amazing service tonight, so please pray for your leaders to preach a powerful message. And if you haven't yet, go ahead, leave a like, comment below. We want to build this community. We want to make this better. This is just for us, just for members, so I really hope that we'll spend this time communicating with each other and just talking about all the different things that we've gone through, or just comment on different parts of the podcast. Would love to hear that too. So really happy for everyone joining us, not just today, but for every weekday on the Morning Star Drive. So let's get up, support each other each and every day. Now, today is Wednesday, and one thing that happened last night was our first episode of The Man Cave, and yes, it is going strong, and I'm glad to hear all your reactions to it. I'm already getting calls from other dudes that want to join the podcast. Already 2 people were added. Of course, we're not going to have like 10 people on at the same time, but hopefully we can get some good teams of guys that want to talk about guy stuff, right? And it just kind of opens everyone's eyes to the window of a man's heart kind of thing. And like I said, I'm not saying that men's hearts or men's thoughts are more important than girls. It's just that we're in a crazy situation where we don't have many guys, and we're wondering what's the best way for us to deal with the guys that we have, or how to bring more guys into this history. So I did talk about wanting to have a girls' version of this, like maybe even reacting to the guys' videos. So, you know, I've already got 2 people on board, so I'm just hoping for more and more people, more girls. I think we need at least 3 girls to start. I found that our 3rd episode for the guys, we only had 3 people on it, me and 2 others, and it was great. Like, the conversation flew really, really quickly. I'm not sure if it's because it's less, but 4 is okay too, but I'm thinking at least 3 people to start on that, so I'm just excited, guys. I'm super excited to have content for different people on this platform. No, not everyone's going to enjoy all the different platforms or the different segments in podcasts, but it's something that I think will kind of begin to touch on many different people, and they'll be able to like say, oh, I really like this episode. I really like this one. I really like that one kind of thing. And like I said, next week from the 18th, we're starting Love and Life. Right? Love and Life. It comes out from next week. This is Aaron and Chelsea, newly married, blessed family, going through their life of love and faith. And for me, this is actually one of the ones I really wanted. Like, it's quite interesting for me because we never really see that side of married couples. We don't really know how they're doing it. There's a lot of focus on like campus and SS. So we know, we have a lot of focus on what they're thinking and what's going on in their lives. But I do think, I believe, and I know that family is such a big part of the church too. So I'm super thankful and grateful that they can do this as a couples project too. Last night, most of you guys won't care about this. I was watching the Lakers and Warriors game. Playoffs on right now. Loved it. And it's kind of cool because I was watching together with a friend on Zoom. So we're on Zoom looking at each other. Like, we're watching the TVs in our own homes, but we connect on Zoom because so many times, we'd be texting each other during the game, right? And, you're not going to sit there texting while you're watching. So I was like, let's just do it on Zoom. So I connected on Zoom, and it's so much better because we see each other, but we both are watching the TVs, and basically we can talk and have reactions while we're listening to the game. So he's a Warriors fan. I like LeBron. And it's just so fun to trash talk them. If there are any other Warriors fans out there, if there are, let me. I want to know. I want to hear your trash talk, right? I want to see you. Because after getting trashed in Game 4 and now you're down 3-1, I want to hear where all these Warriors fans are. Yeah, you guys are not sitting in a good position right now. Either way, the poll on superpowers, I think it's kind of cool. we have like the first one is flying, 47%. And I think that's going to save a ton of money because you don't have to ever, you don't actually ever have to, go into an airplane. You can just go and fly wherever you want to fly. I think that's kind of cool. Invisibility is number 2 at 25%. And I think that one's kind of cool too. A little bit scary also for everyone else. But the one that was most interesting to me was someone actually commented that they wanted the ability to read people's minds. And I was like, that sounds kind of good, but also a bit scary at the same time when I think about what I think about at times. You know what I mean? Like, I don't think I actually, if you knew every thought in my mind, I think it's the same with everyone. I don't think I could actually remain a pastor if everyone knew every thought in my head, right? Like the closest, I'll tell you this, the closest thing I've ever seen to someone being able to read other people's minds was when I was in Korea. I met with a member who could see all spirits all the time, walking around. And this person sees all of them, right? And she sees Jesus, she sees angels, but she also sees demons and Satans. So you got to think about this. Can you imagine living in that type of world where you're constantly seeing it? And, there are a lot of people, I wouldn't say like a lot, but I think proportionately we have way more people like that in Providence. Like many of them, and I talked to like 3 people about it. Many of them thought they were crazy when they were children. And parents even took them to the hospitals to get checked up for insanity, whatever it was. Many of them were misunderstood by so many people that they eventually decided to pretend that they couldn't see it. And I think that's a scary thing to have that much access, right? And I think it's good that people can't see our thoughts. And I think that's the reason why God made it, because we're not perfect and we're not, like there's that movie, what is it? What Women Really Want? It's one with Mel Gibson and Helen Hunt, where he can read all the women's minds. But, it shows it in a very funny way, but it also shows that how difficult it really, really can be to hear everything that's going on around you, right? Like, can you imagine that you couldn't even shut that off? But even when you want privacy, you hear everything? Man, that's just way too much for me. Yeah, I thought about that for a bit, like, that'd be kind of cool. But then I'd be like, that would be difficult. I don't know. What do you guys think about that? To be able to, because that's the one comment that a lot of people reacted on, like, ooh, that's a scary thing to do. Either way, I had an interesting question yesterday. Someone called me. And they messaged me and they said, in Matthew chapter 7, verses 1 through 5, right? Matthew chapter 7, verses 1 through 5. So this is in the Sermon on the Mount, right? And it talks about not judging others, but check and repent on yourselves. Like, don't take the plank out of someone else. No, don't take the speck out of someone else's eye when you have a plank in yours. Right? And then the next verse, all of a sudden in verse 6, it says, do not give dogs what is sacred. Do not throw your pearls to pigs. So how did Jesus link them together in one sermon? Right? So there's a couple things you need to think about when it comes to, like, when we're reading the Bible. I'm super thankful that people are asking questions about the Bible because it means they are actually reading the Bible. Okay? So I think it's a good question too, because many people can confuse, like, does that really make sense? One says to judge, but it looks like you're judging them again because you can't just give pearls to pigs or whatever it is, right? So in Matthew chapter 7, verse 1 through 5, it talks about judging. And the key point of Matthew chapter 7, verses 1 through 5 is talking about taking offense of a person's actions or thoughts, which is pretty crazy right now in society where everyone's taking offense to everything people say or everything people thinks, right? It says don't take offense to them. And the bigger word that comes from verse 5 is hypocrisy, right? Which means that you do the same things or you have similar problems and yet you're calling out someone else on theirs. So if you're struggling with the same thing, then it's hypocritical to call someone out on theirs, right? Does it mean that your sin is bigger? Well, it kind of is, because it's yours and you're dealing with it every day when you only see it once on someone else on the outside. So if you're struggling to fix it, you know how hard it is, then it would be wrong to tell others to fix it even more, like fix it more quickly than you are. Or you're going through it and you're not understanding what they're going through either. So it's more about better to focus on yourself, about people's actions and their thoughts, not taking offense to them, right? Now, the one thing you do have to remember about Matthew chapter 5 through 7, which is the Sermon on the Mount, right? The famous sermon of Jesus, is that Jesus spoke for hours and hours, and some scholars even say that his sermons were spoken over days, right? When you hear Matthew chapter 5 through 7, it is not word for word, but it's a summary of his sermon. So if you think about this, when you guys, even right now, when your the sermons are about 45 minutes to an hour, just my note taking is about 6 to 8 pages. My note taking, right? So that's like an hour sermon. But can you imagine if Jesus speaking for hours and hours and hours? Do you think he only said those things from Matthew chapter 5 through 7? It's basically a summary, right? It's a basic summary of what's happening. So to link the two, there might not even be a link because it's a summary of what he said. There's way more that was in that sermon than just that. So let me give you another thing to think about when it comes to linking Jesus' sermon from verses 1 through 5 into verse 6. From the time that of Jesus' death until the time that the first gospel was written, it was 40 years. It took 40 years. So when you look at history, it kind of gives us there's not a lot of direct evidence about what happened in this period, but it does suggest that the early Christians were engaged in one of the most basic human activities, which is storytelling. And then after these stories were told more and more again and again, it wasn't until the year 70 the evangelist known as Mark wrote the first gospel, right, which means good news, right? And we will never know the writer's real identity, for Mark. But even if his name was Mark, since it was common practice in the ancient world to attribute written works to famous people, we don't know if it was Mark or whoever it was, but it took 40 years after Jesus' death, right? So a lot of it was storytelling, a lot of it, and we didn't get the full direct evidence of Matthew's chapter 5 through 7, or even the entire Gospels, first 4 books of the Gospels, right? So verse 6, just to put it into context, it's more about how much people value something. Like, don't give pearls to pigs and give to dogs what is sacred. And we know that what it means here is that pearls and sacred is something valuable. We're just talking about the words of God, and don't give it to pigs and dogs that don't value what is sacred, right? So it's like, don't just give the words to anyone. And that might sound like you're judging them, but it's not. Because you have to put it into context. You really want to put that into context, right? So from what we hear, like even from what Sunseam says, he says how to evangelize and give the word. It's very clear it's not a judgment, but it's from actually seeing people react to the word and how they actually value it, right? So the way that Sunseam said evangelism is like sweet potatoes, right? Or like when you're steaming potatoes. So you steam them, and when do you know they're ready? You have to open up the lid and poke the potatoes. If they're soft, they're ready to eat. If they're still hard, you leave them in there, right? So what is Sunseam saying here is like, yeah, give the word to them a little bit, see their reaction. Do they really care about it? Or is this something that they want? Do they really value it? Is it something that's necessary at their time right now? And if not, then move on. It's not their time yet. Come back to them a little bit later. And Jesus said the exact same thing in Matthew chapter 10. If you look at verse 7 through 14, what Jesus said, remember when he sent out the 72 in twos, he says, go and preach, make miracles happen. But here's what he says in verse 14. If anyone will not welcome you or listen to your words, leave that home or town and shake the dust off your feet. So even Jesus is like, yeah, go preach the words, go make miracles happen. But if people don't welcome you there, then go somewhere, shake the dust off your feet and go somewhere else. And that's kind of the context where Jesus, like, he's not just saying that you prejudge them and say that, that person's nose is too big. They're not going to love the word. Oh, look at that person. Their eyes are too round. Oh, that person's head is huge. Oh, that person's got thunder thighs. You can't prejudge. And that's why the word has to be given out first. And then you see their reactions. And then you can, take away, don't give pearls to pigs or give to dogs what is sacred. Both Sunseam and Jesus talk about it in a way where you have to test it out a little bit, see how they react, and then go forward after that too. So that would be my thoughts on that. Oh yeah, actually, I had an interesting conversation yesterday, and actually this wasn't even yesterday; it was just a few hours ago. Interesting conversation. It's a friend of mine, no longer in Providence, used to be a leader and stuff like that too, but still, of course, interested in Sunseam. Is calling me about the full situation. And it was really interesting to see this person's point of view because they no longer are at church. They don't hear the words and they only know what they known from like years back, right? he asked me what I thought about it and how are the other members doing and how they are taking this situation. And I told him, like, yeah, this is what's happening here. These people are still here. Some people are on the other side, whatever it was. But I was super happy in the beginning just to know that people are interested. They're interested about the full situation. And of course, if they're people that are not well researched, and if they're a bit, they're going to be confused. Even when it comes to the Netflix, like the Netflix document, they'll be even confused and maybe even a little convinced by Netflix too, which is understandable, especially if you haven't been around much and you don't research the documentaries and know about each of those witnesses, right? So I was super glad that this good friend of mine reached out. So I sent them my summary of the Netflix documentary to listen to. But of course, it's interesting how it always boils down to this one type of reasoning, which makes absolutely no sense to me. And I said, this is my personal opinion. And, I'm always wanting to be reasonable, and I always want to be rational about a situation, especially when it comes to evidence, right? So, the thing that kind of comes into their mind is, isn't it so weird that why would so many people be saying it? There should be something true. Or like, why would they lie kind of thing, right? And I told him that I personally think that it's not a very good reason to believe just because of sheer numbers. You can't base it on numbers. It has to be based on proof. And that's why this is the way the judicial system works. It's not based on the number of people that accuse. It is based on evidence of who can prove. Like that's the way it should be, right? Everyone can accuse, but in the end, it's really about who can prove it, right? Because if it goes by sheer numbers, just look at the internet right now on Twitter and other places where, like, I like Joe Rogan, but he averages over 1,500 dislikes per episode, people saying negative things. But does that mean he's bad because of the numbers? He has 16,000 likes, but does that mean it's good? You know what I mean? Like, does it really go by numbers? In this case, when it comes, without evidence, everything is purely subjective or basically turns into opinion or what they think. So, like I said, I want to remind everyone, if you get these types of calls, in your head, you got to keep reminding yourself, there is zero evidence of Sunstein being guilty. Zero. There are no photos. There is no video. There is one audio from Netflix, which is now under dispute, and it's going through forensics right now, and there's no DNA. Those are the four most important. Did they do it or not? And that's actually one of the questions the person asked. Is there anyone who has eyewitness? And the answer is no. And the most important things to prove guilt, photos, video, audio, DNA, does not exist. And as for more evidence as more evidence comes out, we're starting to see a better picture of what is happening. We are. You go, oh, I didn't know about this. Oh, okay. And we start to see, oh, okay, so this is the type of evidence that's out there right now. So that's why I told this person, and like I tell you guys too, just don't be deceived by irrational, unreasonable thoughts and whatever people tell you, right? Because the last thing someone told me was, oh, I heard that there were so many settlements that Sunstein did. Always ask for evidence. Always ask for evidence. I don't believe it just because someone told me. Well, is there a copy of the settlement? How many people are there? Has anyone testified? Do we know who they are? And then on top of that, we also have to understand what is a settlement? Why do settlements happen? Do settlements always happen because of guilt? And the answer is no. So there's so many different nuances and things that come out that people don't really understand. But when someone says, oh, there was a settlement, first we got to know if it's true or not. And then we have to understand what the heck is a settlement. A settlement is not an admission of guilt. One example, some people settle because it's just going to cost way more money to go through it than to actually, then it's better to just settle. It's way better to go through a settlement than go through all the amount of money it's going to cost for the lawyers and such, right? Yeah, there is. And there's multiple different reasons, right? And that's why, I do suggest of course you're not going to get the full truth when it comes to law and legal disputes, but watch some legal dramas and stuff. They will go through the actual truth of why sometimes settlements are better. They will go through it. Sometimes people go through settlements because they don't want to pay more. They don't want to put it into the hands of a jury that's more sympathetic, and that's going to make them dish out even more than that, right? So that's why, settlements, just the settlement itself is not evidence. Like, it's not 100%. So that's why for me is like, number one is ask for evidence. If they said it, there's that, then go ahead and ask for it. Just ask for it, right? Who are they? How many people? How many have testified, right? Or do we know who they are? And then after, if it's true or not, we also have to, verse ourselves really well in what is a settlement. Why do settlements happen? Do they always happen because the person's guilty? The answer is no. And that's why, knowledge is so powerful. Or if you don't have the knowledge and someone says they settled, and then automatic guilt, that's just ignorance. It really is. It's about knowing how things happen, knowing why things happen too, and finding out, is it really real or not? I'm not going to believe in something just because someone told me, right? So, if anything, please be vigilant. Vigilant. Remember, we have to prove nothing. Why? Because we are sitting in a place that we were always at, right? They are accusing, and because they are accusing, they need to prove, right? The burden of proof is on the accuser. And thus far, the gap between their evidence and their conclusion is so wide. And this is why I sit comfortably where I am right now. Because the gap is too big, right? Like, I had a conversation with another friend who's talking to some people on the, who are on the other side, right? And when they talk about me, like, they totally dismiss me, right? And they'll say that, don't talk to Sky about it because he'll just make up any reason not to believe the evidence. And my response is, it's because the evidence is weak and it has no ground. It stands no ground. If it did, it would have already been used in court. And the case would be over if it's that, like, wow, that's the smoking gun. Personally, I think it's the opposite. I think the other side is trying to make everything sound like it's true. Because the evidence is so weak, for me, it looks like the other side is trying to force it to be true. That's just from my opinion, right? So, you got to think about it. The evidence we've got so far is not reasonable or rational to hold any ground at this moment. And I'm sorry, like, I know there are people out there that we care about and we love, and they're the ones giving their testimony, right? And they're saying that, but this is what I went through, why don't you believe me, kind of thing. And the answer is, it's not because I sit there because I hate the person. It's because in something this big, right? Remember, this is not something like just between friends, like, hey, and then, because of that I lost $5. Like, it's not something between two people, and the result of it is not, it's not really life-changing when it's between me and my friend or some small things. This is about sending someone to jail. You need good evidence. Besides, this is my testimony. And if everyone understands this point too, it's not just the courts that tell us you have to have a witness, right? Maybe two witnesses to be even more stronger. And usually the witness cannot be a friend or family, usually, right? I can't base, like, if you look at, you can't just base on a testimony of a single person without a witness to them. And this is why the Bible even says, look at John chapter 5:31. Jesus says, if I alone bear witness about myself, my testimony is not true. If you look at even Jewish legal procedure back then, a person couldn't testify alone on their own behalf because they could be a liar. They could be making something up, could be doing revenge or something else. A single witness cannot establish facts. Right? So even in a courtroom setting, 2 or 3 witnesses were required. That's like Deuteronomy 17:6, Numbers 35, verse 30. And later in this gospel too, Jesus will make the point in John chapter 8, verse 14. Right? So in this context, you have to understand that, when it comes to court and something so serious as sending someone to jail or accusing them or them being guilty of a crime, that's something so serious, it can't be based just on what someone says. And it's not just 2,000 years ago, even today. In America, in Canada, in most court systems, you can't witness just by yourself, right? Like I said, if it's something small, like when we grow up in high school and we have bets between our friends and we call each other out, it doesn't, then go ahead and believe it. It doesn't make it, go ahead. But it's when it's dealing with someone's life, and that can affect people for the rest of their lives on both ends. You have to take it seriously, right? You can't just base it just on what someone said. You have to be reasonable, wait for the evidence, and you can't overreact like there was a settlement. I'm not saying there was. Someone's saying there was. I'm like, where's the proof? Show me where the proof is, right? And then on top of it, I'll be like, what is a settlement? Why do people settle? Is it always because someone's getting... No, I'm going to look at it in a very, very reasonable way, right? I can't, I'm not going to like jump on it and then, base someone's entire life going to jail on that. That makes no sense to me. So that is something that I do think people need to think about, right? Don't get emotional. Don't jump on evidence. Say, oh my gosh, but what about this? No, it should be, oh, that's interesting. Number one, prove it to me. Number two, let me just do some research on what a settlement is. And then from there, we're able to kind of get a better, more reasonable and rational thought process of what this actually means, right? So that's why for me is, yeah, I understand what people are saying. And I understand that, some things look bad optically, but you have to look at things differently, especially when it comes to someone's life, right? And I'm not talking just about Sunday. I'm talking about both sides, right? We have to understand it properly. And once we do this, I think it'll be much easier for us to kind of handle the full situation without overreacting, doing things emotionally, or doing things irrationally and unreasonably. I use those two words because this seems to be the two things that people in society today do not have: reason and rationale. I'm just going to say this because I watch YouTube, I see what's going out there, and for me, I'm just like, it's ridiculous. People don't have reason and rationale. It's so... like there is such a deficit of it in this society that is kind of shocking to me that these people are actually surviving, right? But either way, that's my opinion, guys. Sorry, I don't want to get too emotional about it, but that's just my feelings on it too. Either way, okay? So before we get into our word study for today, which is not obviously, but it's going to be on the life of Luke, since this week's scriptures are going to be on the book in the Gospel of Luke, let's get into our first break.
It's 1,000-year history, right? We belong together, you and I. And you're always gonna hold me tight. Whoa, whoa. You're my groom and I am your bride. And my spirit's lifted up so high. It's the wedding banquet of all time. And you'll hear me sing, bridegroom, 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 I love you, I love you, I love you. And I'll hear you say, beautiful bride, I love you, I love you too, I love you. Count the stars in the sky tonight, let your love lighten up the sky. Countless blessings, how your heart just shines. Ooh, oh, oh, oh. Promise always to be by your side, living with you in my daily life. We're a team that you can't deny. Oh, oh, oh. Bridegroom, 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 I love you, I love you, I love you. And I'll hear you say, beautiful bride, I love you too, I love you. Now let me say, you, my eternal loving bridegroom, me, can't help clinging on to you. Me and you, nothing can replace my love for you. Bridegroom, bridegroom, how I love you. Bridegroom, bridegroom, how I love you. Bridegroom, bridegroom, how you love me too. It's 1,000 belong together, you and I. It's the greatest history of all time.
All right, so let's get into the word study for today. And of course, we're going into the book of Luke. And I wanted to kind of do this in a fun way. And I want to talk about this, Luke's life and what he went through with Paul, kind of like in a first-person narrative, so you can kind of see what Luke was going through. Like, if you guys don't know a lot about Luke, he's the third gospel in the Bible, and he's probably when it comes to writing, how much contribution he wrote to the New Testament, he actually wrote over like 25% of the New Testament are all his verses. 25%. And he only wrote 2 books, which is Luke and Acts. And it's the largest contribution by any single author. And it's more than Paul, more than Peter and John, whoever it was. And what makes it even more interesting is Luke was the only non-Jewish author of any New Testament book. And one thing that's really interesting is Luke, as we best can tell, he never met Jesus. Never met him, right? He learned everything through eyewitness interviews and meticulous research. And probably there was like a wealthy patron that was hiring him to do it. And this is kind of, we're trying to figure out who this Theophilus is because he keeps writing to him in both the book of Luke and Acts, right? So let's get into like a first-person narrative of Luke, the beloved physician, right? And what he went through in his life. Okay, so let's go into Luke's life through his eyes, and we'll do like a first-person narrative. Hello, my name is Luke. I am a physician, or I was a physician, and I suppose I'm known better now as a historian these days, but you might just know me as Luke. The year was AD 67. It was Emperor Nero of the Roman Empire, and he'd been emperor for 13 years, and winter was coming soon. I was in prison in Rome with the Apostle Paul before the end of his life, just weeks before they would remove his head simply because he followed Christ and encouraged others to do the same. Now, I suppose it would be more accurate to say Paul was actually the one in prison, and I was there to care for him and help with his letters. Together, in that jail, we wrote to a young pastor named Timothy as he pastored a church in Ephesus. Timothy's father wasn't Jewish, just like my mother and father. Speaking of letters, even in the early years of Paul's ministry, when he wrote to the church in Galatia, he said that his body bore the marks of Jesus. By this, Paul meant that his body showed the physical scars of suffering for Christ. As a physician, let me assure you that this was an understatement. Paul's wounds were frequent and severe. Near the end, he couldn't even fully stand erect. That's what happens when you've been beaten repeatedly to the point where your back becomes one giant open sore, and you've been thrown into the dust and dirt. Then you hobble away, or more likely, you are carried away to a friend's house that has no antibiotics, no hydrogen peroxide, neosporin, or whatever it is. You spend the next week drifting in and out of consciousness as your body fights off infection and fever. As Paul's personal physician, let me assure you, when Paul said he bore on his body the marks of Jesus, it was an understatement. But let me back up. My profession trained me to make observations, how to look, how to interpret, how to record. Then, how to re-look, reinterpret, and re-record. As I worked with suffering people, I saw something universally true. I saw that people almost always avoid suffering. I lived in the early middle period of what was called the Pax Romana, the Peace of Rome. The ideal, although only few could achieve it, was to avoid suffering at all costs. If suffering was necessary, well, then others should do it. Better to direct the common laborers than to labor. Better to direct the armies than to fight in them. That's why, at various times, more than half of the Roman Empire were slaves. We outsourced our own suffering. It was a decadent and indulgent culture. And in these respects, we were not far from your culture where the good life drives cars that don't break, owns computers that never malfunction, and has bodies that don't decay, and treasures stuff that shines. This was the good life. Now, when I first met Paul, it was 20 years or so from the resurrection of Christ. So roughly around AD 52. I met Paul in the city of Troas in what you call Asia, perhaps 100 miles north of Ephesus. When I met Paul, he was just traveling through Troas in the middle of his second missionary journey. But to be clear, Paul never really just traveled through a city. In fact, when I met him, he had recently come from Lystra, where he was stoned and left for dead. Anyway, Paul and I sailed the same ship back from Samothrace to Macedonia. And while there, I cared for him. I treated his wounds, which had healed but poorly. What was odd about Paul, very odd, was how he seemed to move towards suffering. As we traveled and I attended to him, Paul told me how he had been raised in the scriptures. He studied under the best Jewish teachers. He explained to me how he had originally persecuted those who followed the way, as it was called, those who followed Jesus. He also told me that while en route to the city of Damascus, Jesus appeared to him in bright, stunning light. The light blinded him, but then the lights came on, so to speak. Paul came to understand what he called the gospel, the good news of Jesus. God in past times had overlooked sin and not fully punished it, instead choosing to take the full weight of sin and crush the Messiah with it. And that's what he said happened when Jesus was crucified. Now, to my culture, this was also strange. Foolishness, really. At the time, I didn't know much about messiahs, but I knew that they didn't die and they didn't suffer. I watched Paul minister in Neapolis and then Philippi. I watched this rugged man speak so gently with women. There was this one businesswoman of some notoriety named Lydia, and she even became a follower of Jesus. After that, I didn't see him again for another 5 years. When I saw Paul the next time, well, he hadn't gotten any younger. His injuries were worse. Paul was traveling through Philippi on his final missionary journey. He was visiting all the places and churches he had been to before, but this time I would stay with him until the end. In the interest of saving space, I'm leaving out many details, but eventually we made it back to Jerusalem. By this time, there was no small commotion about Paul. The word was out that Paul defied the Jewish customs and faith. These were only half-truths, of course. A great chain of events was put in motion over a controversy about who Paul did or didn't take into the temple grounds. Paul, many times over, could have broken the chain. He could have ended the suffering. Humiliation, beatings, imprisonment, hunger, a shipwreck, and snakebite. But he didn't avoid the suffering, he pressed on. Paul appeared before governors and kings, sharing how the light of God had touched him, appealing even to Caesar himself. When I ended my second volume, Acts, this is where Paul was, waiting in Rome under house arrest. Eventually, he got out, but not for long. The persecution under Nero intensified. There was a fire in Rome, and the question arose of who to blame it on. Nero chose Christians. So he killed them. He killed us. He burned us as torches at parties, dressed us in animal skins, and fed us to wild animals. Paul was sent back to prison. Paul, a man who had lived for others, was alone. Well, not exactly. I was there. But his body was failing. His ability to see clearly was gone. He could not stand properly. Each movement caused pain. Sleep was sporadic. In short, suffering abounded. But so did the certainty of Paul's hope in Jesus. Together from prison, Paul wrote to Timothy, Therefore, do not be ashamed of the testimony about our Lord, nor of me, his prisoner, but share in suffering for the gospel. For Jesus abolished death and brought life and immortality to light through the gospel, which is why I suffer as I do. Not only did Paul not avoid suffering, but he actually moved towards it. He didn't do this for the sake of seeking suffering in and of itself. For the superior joy of knowing Christ and making him known, Paul followed God wherever it led him, which often entailed suffering. And as Paul did this, he had a certainty about his life and mission. He had a certainty about the hope of the gospel of Jesus Christ, and that certainty freed him to love even when it was costly. I think he felt free because he was certain Jesus had moved towards suffering for him and for the whole world, which is what I wanted Theophilus to know, and this is what I want you to know with certainty. Christ moved towards suffering to save sinners. Right? So this is very, very interesting. It's Luke talking firsthand of his life, right? And the things that we know about Luke is really, really interesting. How he was, first of all, a non-Jew, but he was really able to connect that he was together with Paul on his last missionary journey. He wrote the letters together with him, and he was able to kind of see what happened after writing the book of Acts, writing the book of Luke too, from his, the eyewitnesses eyewitness testimonies where he was talking not only to Paul, but to Peter and John and other apostles like that too, so we could get a better idea. Right? So I think it's something that it's very, very noble, the life that Luke lived, and it's very interesting how he came to Christ through Paul, right? So a couple things that are interesting about Luke is, number one is Luke's symbol is actually the ox, right? So if you look in traditional Christian iconography, each of the four evangelists, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, they are represented by a living creature. So Matthew's symbol is an angel or a man. Mark is a lion, Luke is an ox, and John is an eagle. So there is a foreshadowing of this in the Old Testament prophet book of Ezekiel. And the prophet, Ezekiel writes heavenly visions of four living creatures, the descriptions of which include, their faces were like this. Each of the four had a human face. On the right, they had like a lion, and then the ox, and then an eagle. This is what Ezekiel talked about. And each of the four creatures is meant to personify or symbolize a particular quality or characteristic that stands out in one of the Gospels. So Luke's symbol is the ox, a creature known for its strength, reliability, and service to mankind. And this is fitting because Luke emphasizes Jesus' role as both priest, the one making the sacrifice, and the sacrifice itself. The third gospel, Luke, which includes much of what we know about the events leading up to Jesus' birth and childhood, known as the infancy narratives. Very early on in the gospel, Luke tells a story of Zechariah, the priest, the father of John the Baptist, right? Offering sacrifices to God in the temple. And Luke speaks of Mary's role in Christ's life. And the sacrifices that she voluntarily made in order to usher in God's plan of salvation for mankind. And you can see this, for example, when Joseph and Mary present Jesus in the temple as an infant, the prophet Simeon tells Mary that a sword will pierce her heart. And all of these sacrificial figures, like Jesus, Mary, Zechariah, are symbolized in the ox. Another interesting thing that you'll find out about Luke was a confidant of the Virgin Mary. Right? So as mentioned above, each of the four Gospels stresses different themes and facets of Jesus' life. So one of the emphasis of Luke's Gospel is the role of the Virgin Mary. So the first two chapters of Luke's Gospel, comprising 132 verses, are dedicated to the infancy narratives of which Mary plays the most central role besides Jesus. So Luke chronicles the Archangel Gabriel's visit to Mary to announce the good news, and Mary's visit to Elizabeth, the nativity, the visit of the shepherds, Jesus' naming and circumcision, Jesus' conversations in the temple at age 12, and his family life with Mary and Joseph in Nazareth. The level of detail in Luke's account of Jesus' early years has led historians to believe that Luke must have known Mary personally and heard about these events firsthand from her. So in addition to the Virgin Mary, Luke also mentions Elizabeth, Simon's mother-in-law, a mourning widow, a prostitute, So in addition to Virgin Mary, Luke also mentions Elizabeth, Simon's mother-in-law, a mourning widow, a prostitute, woman of Galilee who followed Jesus, Jairus' daughter, a woman with hemorrhages, Martha and Mary, a crippled woman, and Mary Magdalene. And in doing this, Luke was highlighting the fact that the gospel message is meant for the whole human race, men and women alike. While much of the ancient world was male-dominated, Jesus went out of his way to bring God's love to women too. And that's something very big at that time, many of whom were among the most forgotten and cast out members of society. And it's because of his emphasis on the Virgin Mary and woman in general that Luke has been called the Marian gospel and the gospel of woman. Right, so very, very interesting here too. So there's a lot of things that we can learn from Luke, but he is someone, even though he is not a Jew, he is a Gentile. And in most cases, for a lot of us here in the foreign countries, most of us are not like the new Jews or the new Israel of this time. Yet we can hold such a significant role, just as Luke did, becoming one of the most important figures in the New Testament, contributing the most verses, the most detail, right, in the book of Luke and Acts. So I hope it's something that's very encouraging that all of us can learn from also. All right. So there it is, guys. That is the story of Luke, and a very, very interesting way of going into a narrative of a first-person account of what Luke went through and what he observed as he was following Paul around. All right. So before we get into health is happiness, let's get into our second break.
Through the winter snow and rain, when the coldness hits your face, when you're racing against the wind, pray the storm will go away. Then you whisper your word, your hands part the clouds, your bright rays of hope break through the darkest shade. You light up the dark, set warmth to the cold, put an end to the rain, the sins you wash away. How the world's swept up in pain, how the world's condemned by sin, how the clouds are dark and gray, and our hearts are bound in chains. Then you whisper your word, your hands part the clouds, your bright rays of hope break through the darkest shade. You light up the dark, set warmth to the cold, put an end to the rain, the sins you wash away. Though the illness fills the air, we'll have to not despair. Using strength we call from prayer, make the world renewed again. Trying hard to make a change, can't hurt your heart again. Learn how to love you till the end.
All right, so let's get into the last segment for this wonderful Wednesday podcast. And of course, every Wednesday we have Health is Happiness. And who are we going to listen to today? We're going to go back to Mason Mendes over there in Los Angeles. He is the vegan king. And today he's going to talk about how to get your protein in a vegan diet. All right, so everyone, please welcome from Los Angeles. This is Mason Mendes with Health is Happiness.
Hello everyone, and welcome to another episode of Health is Happiness. My name is Mason, and we are here again to talk about protein. Now, last episode, I kind of just gave an introduction about myself, who I am, and it was kind of just conversational, and that's kind of how I like it to be. I don't really write out a script or anything, or have a lot of bullet points. I really just write a few things here and there, or what is absolutely necessary, because I like the recordings that I make to be as conversational as possible. I want to be my authentic self. I don't want to go off of a script or anything like that. So we are here again today to talk about proteins. How do I get my proteins, and where do they come from in my diet? But before we get into that, we need to understand what a protein is. Now, I'm sure all of us are familiar with the word, but what essentially is it? So it is one of the 3 macronutrients, and everyone's diet is based off of the main 3, which is carbohydrates, fats, and proteins. So protein is not a building block in and of itself, but it is made up of smaller building blocks called amino acids. And usually an amino acid is just a chain of different chemical or different elements and that are connected via different type of chemical bonds, and they form a chain. And these chains begin to form 3-dimensional shapes because of the bonds that the carbons and hydrogens and other elements of an amino acid, they connect and coil in on each other, and they form these different structures. So a protein essentially is made up of a chain of amino acids, which is bonded together by peptide bonds. Now, I won't get into too much detail about all the different type of chemical bonds. If you're really interested in that, you can feel free to go on the internet, YouTube, Google, and just see what you can find on proteins and how they are bonded together via all these different chemical bonds. Now, once they form these different structures, their structures are quite critical on how they function. And this is the same with various cells inside your body, and that's something that's talked about in biology. The structure of the cell directly correlates to its function, and it's similar with proteins. So proteins have 3 different stages essentially. There's the primary structure, which is basically the amino acid chain. The secondary structure, which is sometimes, I believe, called an amino acid sheet, because it basically forms like a one-dimensional kind of plane or a 2-dimensional plane, like a piece of paper. And then there's the 3-dimensional proteins, and then there's quaternary structures, which is kind of like, if you can think of a 4-dimensional structure. And something that would fall into that category would be the protein called hemoglobin, which is found in your blood. So that would be an example of a quaternary structured protein. So down to the fundamentals of proteins, the amino acids. There's 20 in total amino acids, but 9, nearly half of them, are essential, meaning you have to get them from your diet. They are essential for the functioning of your body, and you must get them from the things that you eat. All the other amino acids, the other 11, can be made by your body. So they're not as essential. So hence the name, the 9 essential amino acids. These are, again, taken from your diet. When you ingest these proteins, they're broken down by your stomach and intestines by a particular protein called peptin, and it breaks it down into the fundamental amino acid structures. And then once your liver breaks them down, then once those amino acids once the proteins are broken down and utilized by the body, those amino acids are transported into the liver, and the liver begins to synthesize new proteins off of those building blocks of amino acids. So essentially, that's how the body works with proteins, and how it breaks it down so that it could form new proteins that it'll be used. Now, in my opinion, proteins are an incredibly fascinating piece of biology because they're so widely utilized and so versatile throughout your body. So, for example, I'm sure that many people from around the world are listening, but a lot of people have different eye colors. Now, predominantly, you might know people with brown eyes. That is the most common. But there's also a combination of colors. And there's also, so for example, hazel or a grayish color, bluish green, greenish brown, bluish brown. But primarily, we'll stick with green, blue, and brown. Brown being the most common, and green being the most rare eye color, amongst some others. Where does eye color come from? It comes from proteins that are being expressed through your DNA, and it's being expressed in your genes, which is basically, your DNA is basically saying, hey, make this protein because this is what the DNA sequence is expressing, and those proteins will determine the color of your eyes, which is quite cool. If you ask me, I think it's awesome. But proteins are incredibly versatile, and they're used for very many things that are important for the body. And so I just wanted to spend some time going over some of the functions of proteins, some of the primary functions, and some examples of those primary functions. Number one, messenger proteins. And hormones would be an example of a messenger protein. Now, these are something that are secreted by your adrenal glands throughout your body, and some examples of that would be the pituitary gland in your brain, the thyroid, the parathyroid, and some important ones are the thalamus and the adrenal glands that sit on top of your kidneys. Now, all of these glands that are all throughout the body, they secrete these hormones, which basically are signals sent from one part of the body to another to communicate things from cell to cell throughout the body. And so one example would be insulin, which is secreted by the pancreas, and it regulates your blood sugar levels. And it also works in conjunction with your liver to regulate blood sugar levels. So if blood sugar is too high, something is released. If blood sugar is too low, something is secreted by a different gland. So your body is quite fascinating, and God is actually, every time I think of biology, I'm sorry, I'm going to go on a tangent real quick. Biology is so fascinating, and every time I get into it, I really think like how genius God is. He is so meticulous in the work that he has put into the human bodies, that he has made it so that our bodies are able to keep itself balanced no matter what kind of environment, internally or externally, we are living in. It's just absolutely fascinating. But I digress. Another example would be adrenaline, which is secreted by the adrenal glands, which are, again, on top of your kidneys. And this happens when we are under stress. And so what happens is our heart rate increases, the circulation of our blood increases, and our breathing picks up so that this adrenaline could get all throughout our body. And this is when what I like to call the fight, flight, or freeze responses kicks in. Which do you do? Do you fight, flight, or freeze? Oh my gosh, how do I deal with the stress? So those would be examples. Those are examples of messenger proteins. Next would be enzymatic proteins. Now, these proteins help accelerate chemical reactions in the body. Now, they actually accelerate chemical reactions in the body approximately 10,000 times the rate of which they would operate without these enzymes. So enzymes actually help break down food into smaller forms so they could be absorbed into the body. And so an example of this would be, I'm just going to name 3 enzymes which are used to break down the 3 macronutrients. So one example would be amylase, which is actually found in your saliva, and it helps initiate the chemical breakdown of carbohydrates. Second would be one that I mentioned earlier, which is pepsin, which is produced by the cells of the stomach lining, and it helps break down proteins. So proteins begin their chemical breakdown in the stomach. Third would be lipase, and this is in the intestines, and it is produced in the intestines, and it helps initiate the chemical breakdown of fats, breaking them down into their chemical building block, which would be fatty acids. Another example of proteins would be structural. Now, they help create and maintain the body's physical makeup. An example of this would be collagen, which forms connective frameworks for your muscles, bones, and cartilage. So for example, cartilage is your nose, your ears, and a couple other structures in the body. Another example would be keratin, and this is the main component in your hair, nails, and skin. And fun fact, and I apologize because I always pronounce this wrong and have trouble with pronouncing it, but it's the integumentary system. The integumentary system. I think I'm pronouncing that right. So the integumentary system is actually the body's self-defense system. This is actually not well known compared to other systems like the nervous system, skeletal system, muscular system, so on and so forth. But the skin, hair, and nails build up the body's first line of defense. Your secondary line of defense is your immune system. Another example would be elastin, and its function is exactly what you might expect it to be, but it is an elastic fiber that provides stretch and recoil and elasticity for your skin. So those are all examples, those three are examples of structural proteins. Another example that proteins serve in the body is defensive proteins. So they identify and attack harmful bacteria and viruses, basically biological invaders to your body. So if they get past your integumentary system, then these proteins, which are found in your immune system, begin to become active. And an example of that would be antibodies. And they are formed in white blood cells, and they could bind to the receptors of pathogens, and they could attack those pathogens. And so, just to give you a visual, an antibody is basically in the shape of a Y. And at the end of those proteins, at each of those points, they bind to the receptors of various pathogens and fight against them. And the last example of proteins in the body is structural and transporting and storage proteins. And an example of this would be hemoglobin. And hemoglobin is made by red blood cells, and they also bind to red blood cells. And it carries oxygen throughout the body by binding to the oxygen molecule. And it carries it to various body tissues from the lungs. Let's see. One other example would be colbindin. I think I'm pronouncing that correctly, hopefully. Colbindin helps with the absorption and storage of calcium from the intestinal walls. So those are just two examples of proteins that one transports hemoglobin, and the other one, colbindin, stores various molecules in different areas of the body. So really, protein is extremely, extremely valuable, and it is quite quintessential to the survival of a human being. So now that I got all that out of the way, where do I get my protein from? Well, the 9 essential amino acids, of course, must be absorbed by diet. So where do I get them from? Of course, I get them from plants. But how does that make any sense? Everyone knows that if you eat a lot of meat, if you eat dairy, fish, you have tons and tons of protein. So how is it that I could get protein straight from plants if I'm not getting it from eggs, fish, whatever? It is because simply protein is made by plants. How does that work? Well, basically what plants do is actually quite fascinating. While they're performing photosynthesis and they're making their own food so that they could survive and grow, they are pulling nitrates out of the atmosphere as well as pulling them up from the soil that they're planted in. And what they're doing is they're taking those nitrates, those nitrogen molecules, or those nitrogen atoms, and they're combining them and they're connecting them through their different chemical processes and binding them to the amino acids that exist inside of the plants already, thus forming proteins. And as they do this, they just build, various type of protein structures. And of course, since the proteins are already there, and since I went over this in the very beginning, once those proteins are absorbed into my body breaks them down into the fundamental building blocks, which are amino acids, and then my body begins to form them into the necessary proteins needed so that I could perform everyday functions that are necessary for me to survive and carry out the various tasks that I need to perform. So that was a very simple explanation as to where my proteins come from. I spent a lot more time discussing proteins in general because I find them incredibly interesting and I really like biology. But if you're interested in listening or hearing more about how proteins are made, there is a particular doctor that I did listen to speak about this. His name is Dr. Milton. I forget his first name. It also starts with an M, like me, Mason Mendes. Dr. Milton talks about how plants actually produce proteins and how they make the proteins so that way, you could get plant-based proteins. And so that's why if you go and you get like a protein powder, you could still find a plant-based protein powder, which of course I like to consume. And it's basically just pea proteins. So protein taken out of peas, the little round green things. And that's basically how I get my protein. Plants make the protein through photosynthesis and by making their own food and by taking nitrates from the ground and from the atmosphere. And they combine them to their amino acid chains, forming and creating a protein, basically from scratch, which is absolutely fascinating. And God is a genius, ultimate wizard, creator, chef, whatever you want to call him, but he is absolutely amazing. He is a genius, hands down. So thank you all again for listening to me ramble about proteins and all this interesting things. So I'm glad you all were able to join me today for this episode of Health is Happiness. And next time, I would like to just discuss what are some practical things everyone could do to increase their ability to perform physically, do physical tasks, whether it's your sports or your job or whatever it is that you want to do. So next time we will talk about exercise and how we could implement both a combination of muscular exercises and cardiovascular exercises to make you a savage. Okay, everyone. Thank you for joining me today. Again, this is Mason, and if you'll excuse me, I need to go and do some push-ups. Bye-bye.
And thank you so much, Mason, for another wonderful episode of Health is Happiness. A lot of people are learning a lot about what it means to be vegan and how you function. And, it's pretty incredible how your goal is to have the world record with most push-ups in a single day. But I don't know. I'm going to tell you this one thing. I think Chris Jansen has some more material against you for his next Provi com. But let's just wait and see until that happens, all right? So there it is, guys. That is the last segment for today. I hope you guys really enjoyed that. Have a wonderful Wednesday service tonight, and we'll see you guys again tomorrow on the Morning Star Drive on 117.8.
It's the Morning Star Drive 117.8. You soaring up with sky, now's the time, don't delay. I'm sitting in my ride and it's time to fly. So let's realign, just listen and fill your mind.
I'm burning with desire and the passion. Nobody can stop me when I'm like